At this time, I'd like to bring up a very special representative. She's the Vice President of Advocacy and Engagement at Planned Parenthood CCC, and she's going to talk a little bit about that. Please welcome Luz Reyes-Martin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luz. I'm so happy to be here for so many different reasons. Of course, to hear from an incredible author and her work, and to support our local bookstores. And Chaucer's is such a treasure in our community. So we are just so grateful and glad for the continued partnership. I get to serve as the Vice President of Advocacy Engagement for our affiliate, which serves the Tri-Counties, so SLO, Santa Barbara, and Ventura County. And really, our goal is to, see a world and a society where folks have access to reproductive health care that is compassionate, high quality, and free of judgment. And we see that in the nearly 30,000 patients that we see every year across our 6 health centers across the Central Coast. And how important this topic and reproductive health care and access and rights is more important than ever. There are so many different threats to health care, to reproductive health care that's happening right now, to abortion care, to access to abortion care. So I'm so appreciative of an author like Alison for bringing more attention, more scholarly work to this area, and giving all of us the opportunity to hear about a global perspective and an international perspective, as well as what's happening here. Our patients here in Santa Barbara and on the Central Coast rely on Planned Parenthood for a variety of their reproductive health care needs. From STI testing and treatment to cancer screenings, abortion care, family planning. Our doors are open to everyone regardless of their ability to pay. 80% of our patients rely on Medicaid or on a government, subsidized healthcare system. So we are a safety net provider of healthcare in our community, and so our work is more important than ever, and I'm just so appreciative of all of you for being interested in this topic and coming here tonight. Thank you so much, and I want to give a shout out to Riley in the back and Zoe outside, my colleagues. We'll be here if you have any questions about how to become a volunteer with us. One of our most treasured volunteer opportunities is our annual book sale. Since we're in the House of Books, I want to plug that as well. It's a fantastic volunteer opportunity, and if you haven't been to the book sale, please come. It's in the fall. You'll love it. And just help support, literacy and reading in our community, and then also get to support our local Planned Parenthood. So thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here tonight.
Thank you, Luz. So tonight, to give you a proper introduction, we bring Carol Weiss.
So delighted to see so many people here. Alison has been my colleague and friend for 34 years. I'm on the faculty at USC in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. We met at the Claremont Colleges eons ago. We went different ways, different universities, and now we've both ended up in California very happily. This is a big book. I'm biased. My friend is brilliant. She's got a beautiful mind, but it's a big book. It is a big book. Alison has been telling me for years that in this stage of her life, like peak of her career, right, she would like to be a public intellectual. And Alison, I've always considered you a public intellectual, writing on human rights, indigenous rights, so many really important causes, where she bridges, sort of academic theory with politics in the real world. But with this book, you have arrived. This book has come out at the most important time in many of our lives, all of our lives. Yeah. And Diane here, we just met, was an abortion counselor in Chicago, and she's come all the way here to join us. Thank you so much. I know you live here now, but you're here tonight. So I've been told to keep this brief. I want to congratulate you, Alison. And again, it just couldn't have come out. I mean, I read the whole thing in 2 days. And the comparisons, the arguments, it's very accessible. I know you wanted it to be accessible to everybody. And it's just really, I can't emphasize how important it is for us all of us here, in terms of the topic, the cause, and the struggle. So, without any further ado, one more applause. Here she goes.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, for the support from all kinds of people in the community, to Chaucer's for hosting this, and of course to Planned Parenthood for everything they do, and helping to show the real world implications. So I was told to be brief. You know, I'm a professor. I don't know if anybody's mentioned that. I'm going to try really hard. But I'm also supposed to sort of tease the book and give you a sense of what it's about. So I will say briefly why I wrote this book, how I wrote this book, and some of the things that I found, and what it means for us. So why I wrote this book is, of course, growing out of my long-term academic research agenda of investigating patterns of global human rights and wrongs all over the world, and all the different kinds of responses that we have over 30 years, basically. But the real origins of the book are that, like you, Diane, in 1982, I worked at a women's health clinic in San Francisco, and I remember wearing a button that said, "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege," and that was so controversial, right? And the other real roots of the book are that I have two grown daughters who, you know, I treasure, who've walked very different paths in life, and to watch their struggle for their rights, and to be aware of how the context of all of our rights are changing. You know, in terms of the larger picture, we have this slogan that women's rights are human rights. And all of my research coming up to this suggests that the status of women and gender rights is tied to all rights and democracy. The World Health Organization estimates there are 22 million unsafe abortions each year, resulting in 47,000 deaths. And since 2022, we know for sure of at least 6 women who have died from being denied medically necessary abortions. Access to safe abortion is interconnected with maternal mortality, LGBTQ rights, poverty, and race. In the US, of course, most of you know this, in 12 states there's a total ban, and we are now seeing studies that show systematic increases in both maternal and infant mortality in those states. There was yesterday a midwife arrested in Texas. But sort of academically, so the big picture is, why are rights regressing, and how can we get them back? I mean, this is a contradictory moment. We have women coming into political power in many countries. We have modernization of all kinds. So why are we seeing backlash in some of the most modernized places? And why about this issue? What does it represent? We're seeing, for example, liberalization of abortion rights in most of the Catholic countries of Latin America, and regression here in the US. Nominally, supposedly a secular state. Okay, so how I wrote this book is, my last book that came out in 2018 was about another, depressing topic, gender violence worldwide. And for that book, I had traveled and looked at issues in Mexico, India, and the Philippines in particular, and I noticed that there were reproductive rights connections to gender violence in each of those countries that were very important. But also, I saw that in 2018, when that book came out, was the year that Ireland liberalized, was the last country in Latin America in Europe to liberalize abortion, whereas Poland, in the middle of the pandemic, completely shut it down. So within Europe, 2 countries moving in opposite directions. Similarly, always keeping an eye on Latin America, I saw that in Argentina in 2020, Poland is shutting down, Argentina is opening up. And at the same time, its neighbor, Brazil, was shutting down. And then, of course, in 2022, the comparison is America versus itself. So I'm trained as a comparative political scientist. You put together like units or places that have diverged, and you try to see what accounts for the variance and what you can use from that, what lessons you can draw. So I took some research trips along the way to Ireland, Northern Ireland, Poland, and back to Argentina in the process of writing this book. And here is what I found. So the big picture lens was a feminist approach that all societies have a system of gender control that comes before, during, and after the formal political system. And so there's a constant process of renegotiation of rights, roles, and privilege and status on the basis of gender, and that historically is mostly about women, but it's also about gender minorities, and that's why these things tend to move together. And religious trends, economic needs are always going to shape those, but within that process, we have agency and there are politics. So, in general, in the world, modernization and the growth of democracy and capitalism creates incentives for individual rights over population policy and for smaller families and for medicalization of reproductive behavior. But in the 21st century, I suspected this, and this is what I found. In the 21st century, globalization has created a crisis of identity, a crisis of inequality worldwide. And there are really divergent responses to that crisis. And the backlash is occurring so for example, the EU has been very positive for Ireland and very negative for Poland. So the globalization piece aligns with what ends up happening to reproductive rights. And even when I started to look at the US, we might think of the US is not all one country, right? We know this now. So California is an information economy. And we've certainly had our struggles with inequality and globalization, but on the whole, globalization's been good for us. Texas is a petrostate, right? And it follows the same political patterns of the petrostates of the Middle East and Russia. And it was kind of shocking to line that up, you know? Anyway, so as you can tell, you've got this relationship. What's the process there? So in the negative cases, the response to that crisis of globalization is an ethno-nationalist, patriarchal populism. Someone, some politician, some political force, sometimes they're going to pick up on a traditional religious force, sometimes not, are going to organize the groups that are suffering, that are losing status from globalization. And this is usually dominant ethnicity or dominant race, and it's usually men. And you can track where they're losing jobs in the mines in Poland and all this stuff. And that's where the political appeals to nationalism and populism are going to come. And the X factor, so to speak, or the XY factor, that makes those political appeals land is reversing gender rights. And okay, I was at a campus, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I was at a campus presentation, and somebody, a commentator, pulled out a sentence in my book, and I thought, whoa. Oh no, where did it go? Okay. okay, never mind. I can't find it. I'm gonna skip that. Anyway, there's a description of that process. So,
Why do they do that? Why did they pick that?
I've got to find this because I have a sentence that.
No yellow highlighting.
No yellow highlighting. Okay. It is about how. It is about how reversing gender rights serves multiple functions. It, first of all, pushes women out of the competitive workforce. It reinforces the identity of slipping status ethnic groups by raising the population of, dominant babies, right? It thereby helps to shift political power toward those slipping groups, and it creates a culture war basis of appeal for populist politicians who can then claim to serve the interests of the excluded or declining working class while not actually doing any economic work. Those are pretty much basically it. Okay, so you've got this contest, you've got this problem, and you've got this possibility of backlash that's there in all the conflicted countries that are suffering from globalization. And some places nationalism rises, some places nationalism is not as present. But where it is, what determines the outcome? And this is important because this is what we can do about it. Two things: democracy and feminist movements. So when I compared Argentina versus Brazil, Ireland versus Poland, California versus Texas, the two factors that really stand out in determining positive liberalization of abortion rights or regression on abortion rights, gay rights, everything, right? The quality of access and access to democracy. In Ireland, there was a big referendum, just like in California, right? In Poland, it was locked into the courts. The dominant nationalist government was trying to impose abortion restrictions, and even though they had a majority in Congress, they couldn't succeed. So in the dark of night, in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, they smuggled it over to the Constitutional Court that they had stacked previously. Does this remind you of it? Yeah. It's a democracy story. It's a democratic institution story. And we have the same thing at the state level. I mean, Texas, again, formal political science, Texas is one of the least democratic states in the United States, one of the most gerrymandered, one of the least representative. It has the highest levels of voter suppression. So I'm just putting together what we kind of know and showing how it affects us. Okay, feminist movements. So one of the reasons we're doing pretty well in California is that in the run-up to the Dobbs decision, when the threat started to come, there was a group, a coalition of over 40, you may have participated, women's and healthcare organizations that mobilized and talked to the California legislature, and the Women's Legislative Caucus drafted bills, tried to preview things like, even if we keep abortion rights, if people are coming from other states, are we going to have to shield our providers? They drafted all that legislation and worked in advance with legislators. So that is a very effective insider feminist mobilization strategy, right? I mean, Women's March, all that stuff is important, but it's also important to get in there to see where the leverage points are. In Ireland, they reached out to the Irish diaspora and got them to come home to vote in the referendum, as well as having a campaign. In Argentina, and this is one of my favorite stories, not just because I have a special place in my heart for Argentina, but Argentina had a women-led human rights movement that helped overcome the dictatorship, which was where I started my academic research with that the mothers of the disappeared. The women's movement continued to build. So that wasn't a feminist movement, it was a women's human rights movement. But that movement continued to build, and during the middle years, they were one of the most powerful movements in Latin America against femicide, against gender violence. And they started linking up with their neighbors and with neighboring countries' feminist movements. So it was a very natural segue, and it was a very powerful movement because they had all these networks, they had all these links throughout Latin America. So the femicide movements were already linked between Argentina and Mexico, for example. And so the abortion rights movement, which was called the Green Wave, and you'll see the green scarves and you'll see the green symbolism. You know, they even had a color picked out, you know. It's good for a movement. And the other good thing about the Argentine movement is that they were very conscious about a health framing. It's a society that's very, you know, open to and supportive of rights because of the dictatorship experience, but it's also a society with increasing poverty and where people have a lot of sensitivity to social rights, health rights. You don't have to wear a button that says health rights. Health is a right in Argentina. Everybody already believes that. So when they started pointing out the numbers of women dying from illegal abortions and talked about it as a health issue, it helped break up the opposition of Catholic society, not the church itself, but people in society who were Catholic, but they went, you know, pro-life, this is really what it means in our world. And I am so happy to see the US movement, reproductive rights movement, diversifying in membership and identity, diversifying in making more health appeals, diversifying in terms of looking at the full spectrum of reproductive rights. So this is, I mean, abortion is one reproductive right, and it's interconnected with safe pregnancy. It's interconnected with maternal mortality, and so really, you know, those connections, because I will say, as a long-standing reproductive rights activist, we were a little narrow and we were a little complacent. And Roe versus Wade was a very thin reed upon which to put ourselves. So I don't want to get too long, but the last part, which I'm sure you all want to hear, is that I do try in the last chapter of the book to extract the big picture lessons that we could project to other places and to other kinds of rights in our beleaguered world. I think I've got it down to about 6. The first one, of course, as the title of the book says, is defend democratic channels. In our case, it means state governments, judicial independence, and waking up Congress. Lesson number 2 is stay mobilized. That doesn't always mean street protest. I've seen a few things recently about how we need to have campaigns, but different kinds of campaigns. Craft bipartisan coalitions. Now this may sound a little difficult. First of all, think of coalitions on the basis of the issue or the goal. So think about health, think about labor, think about race and racial justice, think about LGBTQ rights. And whoever is willing to sign up for that or has an interest in that is welcome, is encouraged to think about that. In Brazil, there had been some liberalization of abortion rights. It was overly tied to the beautiful progressive Labor Party, and when the Labor Party fell, abortion rights fell and never came back. We don't want to do that. Beyond pro-choice is the foundation, self-determination, but that's the beginning, not the end, right? We have got to keep connecting to health rights and other kinds of rights. Act and learn transnationally. The U.S. So you're all nodding. You know what I mean. But you know, I've been teaching international relations and global studies for decades, and Americans are just remarkably narrow in our knowledge and understanding of the world. There are powerful lessons to learn out there. We're being outpaced in some ways by our international peers. And there are transnational phenomena that are helping to at least compensate a little bit in terms of transborder flows of medication, of migration, and of networks. You know, there are U.S.-Mexico flows now. American women going to Mexico, getting my medication from Mexico. In terms of expanding our appeals, I made that statement about Argentina, we need to reclaim the pro-life frame. We are pro-life, right? You know, to make women's lives the center of the conversation. So, above all, you know, I was reminded that human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and have to be defended and advanced in every generation. So I'm so glad to see you all here. I know that many of you are engaged in this project already, and thank you. I hope that you can get some further guidance from this, and I look forward to any of your questions, comments, observations that can help us advance the conversation. Thank you.
So
Let's
quick
open it up.
question.
Yes.
Poland supposedly has kind of turned around, you know,
Yes.
it was a big surprise and stuff, but obviously it was after a lot of the time that you did that research. So the picture now, has it changed at all since then, and if so,
Yeah.
how?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well,
So
I just visited there and I loved it. So.
I know. I was there last summer as well. So Poland has restored many elements of democracy in terms of the dominant party in the government. It always had the electoral institutions. However, so the new president pledged to restore abortion rights, among other things. He has not been able to do that yet, and that's because the judiciary remains distorted. Right? You have these legacies of the judges appointed by the previous administration, and congressional politics are a little bit distorted. What the best he's been able to do is to turn down the persecution kind of enforcement. So there is now, they've returned to passive tolerance of illegally importing abortion medication or going to neighboring countries. They haven't restored, you know, full-fledged access in clinics and with their National Health Service. And there's been no legislative change, but this is another point, right? For all rights, but especially for reproductive rights, law is the beginning, but not the end. There's law, there's funding, there's access, there's prosecution policies, right? Because, I mean, we have some kind of purple states now where there's a ban on the books, but local officials are not choosing to prosecute and kind of just letting it fly. And we should be very aware of that. So just as before Dobbs, you know, Texas began chipping away at abortion rights in 2018, right, with the heartbeat bill. I mean, and we had the clinic deserts. We had, you know, regulatory persecution of, and you know, having these weird regulations for abortion clinics that caused a lot of them to shut down. So, you know, we gotta keep an eye. I mean, democracy is important, but it's not enough all by itself. Yeah, sorry, long answer, but it
No.
it got me into something else I wanted to talk about. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I have a question in regards to what you, if anything, if in your work you've seen how now, you know, Mexico used to be the place where, you know, abortion, I mean, many women die, right?
Yes, yes.
Because it was illegal, and so some women will come to the United States, cross the border, but now we see the opposite happening,
Right.
right? That especially from Texas and, you know, Arizona, they're crossing the border to Mexico
Yes.
to
Yes.
to get an abortion. Is your book also relate something?
Yeah, I have a little bit about that. That began to happen organically, and of
Yeah.
course we have a border spanning, you know, Latinx population who would have personal ties, but there's more than that to the story. So there are there's feminist organizations, there are Mexican feminist organizations which mobilized because of the problems in Mexico and because of the gender violence that was resulting in a lot of unwanted pregnancy and so forth. So all of that was connected. And then in Mexico, abortion liberalized state by state, federal state by state. It didn't happen all at once, and in fact, it's still a little patchy. So these networks were there. They were already used to assisting poor women. They were already used to helping women to travel between jurisdictions, and they consciously reached out to American organizations and American women, and they set up hotlines and they set up access services, and they were more internationally minded than the American organizations at first. Eventually, the American and Mexican organizations began to meet up, and there were in 2022, 2023, some conferences, cross-border networks, how are we going to coordinate, and some international reproductive rights entities began to ship supplies of abortion medication to Mexico to be quietly distributed to the US. Sometimes they could mail it. Sometimes they would have volunteers take it to the border, and women from Texas or Arizona would just come to the border and pick up their medication. That's not very, there's not a lot of surveillance of medication mailing, and also Americans go to Mexico to get, you know, Viagra and all that other stuff, so, yeah, so there's a lot going on.
Does this show a weakening in Catholicism?
It
Because
shows
we're
a
talking about
weakening
Mexican
in several ways. It doesn't necessarily, so we have, in any religion, right, there's belief, there's institutional we call it belief, belonging, and if you're doing opinion surveys or you're trying to measure, right, so there's what people believe, and then there's how much they belong to an institution and follow its dictates. Belonging to the Catholic Church is weakening all over the world. People's feeling that they can interpret for themselves the basic, you know, they still retain a sense of identity, but they're pretty much going to take their own interpretation of how to do that. They're just not as guided by the church. We also, in a couple of these countries, have the church being a little bit knocked out of political or social influence. I mean, in Ireland, the church used to run these horrific orphanages. They were given money and permission by the government to imprison young women and, you know, illicitly adopt their babies and ship them overseas. I mean, it was just, and a democratic government allowed this into the 1980s. And there were huge scandals, and the government did a big investigation report, shut down those orphanages, paid reparations to some of the women. So the church as an institution got just slammed for that. And in Argentina, the church tragically collaborated with the military dictatorship, so they were not so popular. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering if you can, how you see your book in relation to what's going on, especially now in terms of like DEI, and if you can use your framework of, especially thinking about like states that are regressing, and then especially like Texas and California. I'm wondering what do you see parallels in that movement as well? Thinking about like critical race theory, DEI, and all of this that's currently happening.
Right. So, I do hope that the book sheds light on reproductive rights, gender rights, and women's rights worldwide, and also other kinds of human rights, because as my friend pointed out, you know, and I said I started out working on the dictatorship in Argentina. I mean, I've looked at all kinds of rights and the changing environment, and they were kind of getting better, and now we're facing new challenges. So what I think this shows in terms of those new challenges is, first of all, democratic access matters, controlling democratic institutions. I mean, we have pushback going on, not just about reproductive rights, but about all kinds of issues at town halls, right? As soon as you open a forum, the pushback is there. So, you know, and keeping the judiciary empowered, that's also part of the same story. Another thing that I think it has in common is this ethno-nationalist reactionaries starting culture wars to distract people. And there's some evidence, I have a little bit of evidence about how the religious right in the US was not originally anti-abortion. They were kind of apolitical for a while. Then in about the 80s, they tried a little anti-gay campaigns that didn't work as well. Then they tried to be anti-abortion, but they were looking for a constitutional amendment. That went nowhere. Then they went for the strategy of going to the state level. I mean, that they look for causes. And recently, there's been a discussion, and there's some evidence of this, that they looked for anti-trans as an issue, that they tried a little bit of reviving anti-LGBT rights, and it doesn't really work anymore in American public opinion. So they honed in on the less understood, that was easier to focus on. So I think democracy, culture wars, and those dynamics are very similar. What I'm not sure about, and I'll be honest here, and what maybe you can all contribute to, is what kind of a movement. I mean, I know what works in feminist movements on reproductive rights, and to some extent on civil liberties writ large, you know. But there are issues that are a tougher sell. I think immigration is one, and you know, DEI, and how we reframe, how we mobilize, where the leverage points are. So I think that is our next work.
Was there anything surprising or unexpected that you uncovered through your research, or anything, especially because you've been working in the space for a while, was there anything new that popped up as you were going through your book?
Well, I mean, there were several things. I've stuck to the main story, but I did a few little sidecars. Like I couldn't, this book I was telling people it usually takes me 4 or 5 years. This one was about 6 years. There was a little pandemic limitation too, but you know, it's a big story. It's happening a lot of places. So the dominant conventional wisdom is religion, right? It's traditional religion holding back liberal modernization, and we just have to get traditional religion out of the way and conservatives, you know. And of course, that's not the story, really. Religion is there to be used as a weapon when it retains some influence and when conservative nationalists want to make an alliance. So a surprising thing is that I was working this issue and it was bothering me, and also people were saying, you know, well, is this only really about Christianity or Catholicism, right? And so somehow I found out that Iran had this fascinating population policy changed 3 times under the Islamic theocracy. That when they first came to power, they shut down family planning and, you know, went very traditional. And then there was a social crisis in the 1980s. They had overpopulation. They had this war with Iraq, all kinds of things. And so they discovered Islamic family planning. And they trained women, they trained grassroots rural women, because only women could talk to other women. And they had a big campaign about, you know, we want quality, we want healthy families that can contribute to the state. And so I spent a few months fascinated by this strange story. They achieved the fastest population fertility rate turnaround in the 20th century, right? Because it's all about the interests of the state and the nation. It's not about people's beliefs. It's not about, you know, any of the things they say it is. It's all politics all the way down. So, thanks. I wanted to talk about Iran. I don't want to get in.
Let's take one more question.
Yes.
I used to work for Catholics for Choice, and I work for the Center for Reproductive Rights now. I have a question about religion, using religion the opposite way, because there's also an argument to be made about a religious right to abortion, in that, like, the Jewish faith says that it's not, you know, they don't recognize the fetus as a human being until it is born.
Right.
So you're always supposed to privilege the life and health of the mother. Do you have thoughts on that, about using religion in the opposite way?
Yes, well, this Iran story actually works, and because Islam and Judaism are related, the Quran has that same standard that had kind of gotten buried in the more traditional interpretation. Went like, oh, wait a minute, the Quran says doesn't have a soul until you feel the baby move, right? Which is second trimester, basically. So yes, religions provide, again, there's belief and belonging. There's faith and institutional power. And faith can be a tremendous tool of solidarity, of justice, of critique. So another of our jobs is to find ways to bring in, not just bipartisan, but, you know, people from all sectors and identities who can share the values and help everybody to use the full range of our cultures and traditions to get there.
Alison Brysk, her book is Abortion Rights Backlash. Thank you so much for talking.